so we have a lot of things going on. We have a lot of moral ambiguity in this story. One of the things that is a difficulty in the story is that really Jacob is pursuing something, and he's relentless in his pursuit of that. He wants the birthright. He wants the blessing. He wants to be in the line of the covenant promises of God, and he wants to be blessed in that way. But it's pretty hard to see what good that does him, which is another really interesting part of the story, because you would think that God would be trying to motivate us, right? and so he would say to us, hey, you know what? You can get a lot of things wrong in your life, but you pursue me, and man, things are going to go great for you. But that's not what happens in the story. So he does pursue these things. He's underhanded in the way that he does it, but he does want them, and he ends up having to leave because his brother wants to kill him. He goes to Laban and gets really taken advantage of there. Then has to flee Laban, is at one point in a situation where Laban is behind him pursuing him, and his brother Esau is in front of him coming towards him, and he's really stuck between these two places. And you look at what's happened to him, and you just think, wow, God, that's quite a blessing. So what should we make of that as Christians, as far as reading this story? And again, this is one of those stories that's difficult to explain to a non-Christian, because on first reading, the moral ambiguity between the two characters, but also the ambiguity of just what is it that he's getting out of this? Yeah. What's the reward here?
Well, it's nice to live the time we do, where we get to hear the whole story, and so we know that it ends well. I think it's wrong of us to only think that today matters. It's hard not to think of that. I mean, not in every aspect of our lives, but sometimes we have to. There's an element of faith and trust that God has the whole story in His control, and I mean. Jacob here reminds me of Christ. He's going to suffer and have to endure so many things so that God's plan is fleshed out. And there's value in suffering for that plan to be made whole or, manifest.
Yeah.
But to my first point, I think that it is tough not to only think of the moment. And if we think, well, I don't want to go through anything right now, we could lose sight of the blessings that come later. I mean, he's restored with his brother, and so good will come, but we have to trust that God's got the whole thing under his his hand.
Yeah.
I think, if you look at some of the moral ambiguity, say in Jacob's life specifically, and some of the dysfunction in his life and his relationships and stuff like this. And, part of it, you could look at this and say, we make some wrong choices and have some bad behaviors. And usually there's a fairly natural consequence in our own lives that follows. But quite often as well, sometimes suffering those consequences redeems, can be redeemed as well and lead us to a place where we're not struggling with such behaviors or choices or things of this sort as well.
Yeah.
And maybe this is part of the life of Jacob, just putting some of those things behind him.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the Bible verse talks about our righteousness being like filthy rags. And I think with Jacob, it's really a great way to describe his life. I mean, it's not that he has no virtues, but the virtues that he has are tainted pretty severely, and who of us isn't in that same place? And I think that when you see that, there's a natural connection between the moral ambiguity of Jacob's life and the ambiguity of the blessings of his life. I think those two things go kind of hand in glove. That's kind of the way that works. And I think that one of the things I think that we make a mistake of as believers oftentimes is that we believe that God is justified in the world through happiness. And what I mean by that is that, C.S. Lewis talked about God being in the dock. If God can give a good answer for himself, we have some questions. We're ready, like Job. We're ready to question God, and we're willing to let him off the hook if he's got some pretty good answers. And the answer that we seem to be looking for is happiness. God doesn't actually justify himself through happiness. He justifies the world by his glory. It's not God that needs justification. It's the world. It's creation, and there's a way that creation does that. And creation, or the world, or us, the way that we get justified is we get justified morally. The world is justified to God in a moral sense, and I think that from that standpoint, this story becomes really interesting, because then it's not so much about where Jacob is, but where Jacob is going. It's not so much about Jacob's virtues as it is about the change of Jacob's life. Do you guys understand what I'm saying by that? You don't read the stories of Jacob's early life and tell your kids, hey, you need to learn a few things from aspire to this.
Here's the hero.
Right. You don't do that. Right. But then God is actually I think that when you look at the rewards or the blessings of God being in Jacob's life, you say, well, what good is this? Well, it is good, because what's happening in that struggle is that God's encountering Jacob, and there's a struggle that's going on that the end result, if engaged in with faith, is that Jacob will more closely resemble who God is.
It's funny, sometimes I think, and I think Joseph is one of the better examples where, it's actually other people's sin against him that God actually uses to, prepare him for his calling, essentially, and it's one of those things, like, I think we kind of have this idea of justice in the scales, and like you said, God's got to justify himself. So if these bad things happen to me, well, then that's got to be rectified or something like this. When who am I to tell God how to get me to exactly where he wants me to be?
There are still remnants in our language of a different way of viewing life and the world, and one of the things that I was thinking of recently is the idea of being demoralized, right? So. If you were ever on a sports team, there are times when you're winning and it's great. There are times when you're losing and you're struggling and you're struggling and struggling. And then there are times when you get beaten bad enough that you're demoralized. And that word is a really interesting word to me because I was starting to think, well, what does this have to do with morals?
Sure.
But then as I started thinking about that, I thought, well, there is the word morale. Right, and when we talk about somebody or a team being demoralized, we're talking about them having a lack of morale. But morale comes from moral, so we still are left with the same problem of somehow high morale has to do with morals, and that connection isn't obvious. And so I started thinking about that and thinking about, well, what does it mean to be demoralized? And I was thinking about Yuri Bezmenov, who was a guy who was a KGB agent in India, and he defected to the West, was living in Canada, and did a series of lectures where he talked about the KGB. And he said, look, you all think of KGB as like James Bond spy stuff. He's like, maybe 20% of their budget goes to that stuff. 80% of it is demoralization. They're trying to demoralize your nation.
Yeah.
And again, that word demoralize is really fascinating, and it comes from a worldview that is pre-happiness. And by pre-happiness, I don't mean that happiness didn't exist back then. I mean the idea that somehow God needs to justify himself by happiness was not in their worldview. Demoralization have you guys ever experienced that, like on a sports team
Sure.
or something like that? When you experience that, would you just say, well, what happened is we lost our happiness?
No.
Now, obviously, you're not happy, but
Right.
would you consider that that's really, as long as you could get your happiness back, it would solve that?
No. Hopelessness.
Okay.
I mean, the purpose is gone. I mean, if you're so bad at something, there's no hope. You're on a sinking ship in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't matter how long you bail it out. The water, you're demoralized. It's without hope. That's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, there's no goodness at the end of all this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that happens in demoralization is that all of a sudden, that what happens in a football game, what happens in large areas of life, if you're in any kind of a sport, is that you endure suffering for a prize, right? And in demoralization, the suffering is no longer worth the prize. That's really when you've been demoralized, is because a team can lose and not be demoralized. They're out there, with whatever seconds and whatever strength they have left. They're trying to score that next point. They're trying to, right? They're using everything in them to still try to achieve the goal. When a team's been demoralized, they're not trying anymore.
Yeah.
And they're not trying anymore because all of a sudden it's not worth it to try anymore.
Yeah.
Either it's so certain there's no hope, it's so certain that we're not going to make it, or the good that we're pursuing is no longer worth the suffering. And I think that really what God does is he justifies the world morally. And what I mean by that is God justifies the world by it reflecting his glory. That's how the world is justified. Because when God made the world, he said it was good. And in order for it to be reconciled, justified, justified is a legal term. And, you think about it, you can think about it in a number of different senses, but one of the senses you can think about it is like when you're typing, justified margins. It means they all line up. That the world is brought into line with God. How is it brought into line with God? It reflects his glory. It is good. And that's really, I think, what's happening in the story with Jacob, is that Jacob is not he's a very morally suspect character. And God is going to engage in this. He wants the blessing, he wants the birthright, he wants the covenant. Well, in wanting the covenant, really what he's wanting a union with God. And in that union with God, he's going to have to be justified. He's going to have to be transformed to the glory of God. And so what's going to happen is he's going to have to come to reflect that.
It reminds me of Romans 8, where, the verse we all know that, and we know that God can do all things.
Works for the good.
Yeah. So, but it all works to our good. And then, we think like, that's going to, affect my wallet or, things of the sort. That's my good. But right after it talks about the good being conformed to the image of his son.
Right.
And it's exactly kind of what you're saying here. The world needs to be justified to be in accord with God.
Yeah, and I think from looking at it from that lens, all of a sudden the story starts to make more sense, because yes, Jacob is a morally very suspect guy, and the blessings that he don't really look like blessings, because they're not there to enrich him.
Yeah.
They're not there to make him happy. They're there to bring him into alignment with the glory of God. And that often is going to be a process that's filled with suffering, because we have to be separated from a lot of things that we value that don't have the value that we placed on them. We have to have our illusions pierced. Our eyes have to be. There's a lot that has to take place.